giving me a lot of joy and frustration at the same time. Every day, is a day of survival. We as entrepreneurs or founders sign up for.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the journey is part of it.
For a lot of fintech startup, they have this fear of try and develop. There's this common in the startup world, like, why would you try this idea if Revolut gonna come for it?
I realized that this is the one time where a global payment network is about to be established, and this whole network basically starts with Southeast Asia.
Today our guest is Bobby Liu, a startup veteran. He recently started Qrospay to empower you to travel without cash. Bobby is a founding partner at Med 24/7. Before that, he was a venture partner at Touchstone Partners, a $50 million fund that invests in Vietnam startups where he achieved notable success from backing the right founders. In this episode, we discuss his love for Vietnam, how can you build products and operate in Vietnam. We went deep into his experience as both a founder and an investor, sharing his 30 years of experience, laughing over the joy and the pain of startup life. We show you how investors read founders, and we discuss his favorite investment of all time, plus the art of competing with giants and to design your products around this. You also want to know why AI won't have your startup pitches, and how to stay young and adaptive as an older founder. This episode is for everyone who seeks wisdom in building products and investing, with lots of insight into Vietnam tech scene. With that, I bring you Bobby Liu. Hi Bobby, welcome today to my podcast. It's very good to have you here.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, you've just launched your startup Qrospay. It must be a very exciting moment to launch after over a year of work.
Yeah, uh, I have friends asking me about this, right? And after so many years of doing other things, and then finally returning to I guess I would call it my roots as a founder, as an entrepreneur, right? It's both giving me a lot of joy and frustration at the same time, and usually it happens right next to each other.
Right.
The joy of seeing, the users being happy, right? Obviously, and then the frustration of seeing users coming across some issues or the bugs and that we haven't thought about, right? And then be able to overcome it again, then the joy. So it's always like going this high and low, but I suppose that's what we as entrepreneurs or founders sign up for.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the journey is part of it. So I know that in Singapore you have mandatory military service. How does the military training in Singapore affect you later life as an entrepreneur and investor?
How I don't know, I don't think there's much direct influence. I mean, I belong to a different branch. So because of my leg injury or my knee injury, I couldn't sign up to be an officer.
Mm.
So that pretty much changed, the trajectory of my life. Somehow, I think deep down inside me, I think that had I not had that injury because of sports, and became an army officer or in the military, I probably would have continued on because yeah, as a young man of 2021, I was very enamored with the military service, which is kind of weird because I'm actually not that disciplined a person, and I hate waking up in the morning. But I suppose once you're in that line of work, you just have to do what you need to do, right? And then and being an entrepreneur, you basically sleep at all hours and wake up at all hours,
Mm.
right? So yeah, so I suppose that's not really a big problem. But in terms of any kind of indirect influence, if anything else, military training actually has taught me something, that no matter how difficult a training is, or no matter how in that relation, in that aspect, no matter how difficult a problem is, it will be solved at some point. You just need to persevere. And like military training, you cannot give up
Mm.
because it's critical that you have to go through that training and be proficient in that training program for entrepreneurs as we deal with issues and problems with what we are building. Cannot just ignore it and say, never mind, let's skip that. And the matter of priorities and all that stuff, I think that also helped, in that sense. So it's not so much as a direct influence, the right lesson. But I think it's all that small little things that you go through, or at least for me, go through my military training days, 2 years, 2.5 years, go through that training days. And along the way, you kind of, practice it, right? Okay, so there's one thing that I sort of still do, even from back then, was that every morning I wake up, I still make my bed.
That's very
Yeah.
good. So you got one win for the day.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's of course, we heard, this way of life from one general of the US Army, right? It's a small thing, but then to be able to wake up and give yourself enough time, and then to sort of set, of course I don't make my bed to be perfect, but just to be comfortable enough that when you do come home at the end of the day, you look at it, you walk into your room and you go like, okay, fine, it's ready, right?
Yeah.
Rather than coming back to a messy room. Even at hotels, I do that.
Really?
Yeah, and sometimes the receptionist or the housekeeper was like, why do you do that? We are here to make your bed. I say, no, you're here to clean the room. Bed is mine.
We probably have an excellent Airbnb review as a guest.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope so. I hope so. Yeah.
I would love to lay a property for you, and then you clean up.
Yeah.
You pay the cleaning fee, and then you clean up for me too.
Yeah.
I just This is very interesting. So I study startup Israel, and a lot of their startup unicorn actually have their roots from the military training, where officers met each other and then started companies together. Do you think what would need to be happen in a military environment for that kind of chemistry to happen more often in Singapore, in anywhere else?
Okay, like I said, because I belong to the service wing. Since I didn't become an officer, so I was transferred to a service wing. And in the service wing, once I got posted up to a unit in the service wing, there weren't too much of sort of like camaraderie that you would often see if you were in an active unit, right? So active unit would be something like maybe the guards, the commando, or even like the infantry unit, armor unit. So I think in that aspect, there are a lot more camaraderie, brotherhood, the kind of thing. And I have friends who were in those units, and they still kept in touch with all their army mates, from 20, 30 years ago. And they still have minimally, they still have the yearly, gathering. So I think in that respect, and also I think Israel is in a more precarious situation. Yes, in fact, all my Israeli friends who are founders or even investors and all that said the same thing, right? Because they're, they're in a more precarious situation. Every day, is a day of survival, right? And that sort of kept them very close. So I think maybe in their units, there are a lot more camaraderie, and you get conscripted into army at a certain age. And that's where you get a lot of your first influence in life, what being adulthood is all about. And the other big difference is that unlike Israel or unlike Singapore, everyone in Israel has to serve the army, men and women, right? In Singapore, only the men, mandatory. The women obviously have provided a lot of good services to the military, or SAF we call it, by way of a career position, not so much as a mandatory thing. Whereas in Israel, everyone has to go through, a minimal period. I forget how long, maybe 2 years, right? And then I think the training is a lot more intense in that sense. I mean, not to say that the training in Singapore is not intense, but I think it's very, it's quite different, the situation in Singapore. So yeah, if you read the book, Startup Nation, I think who's the author? Yeah, I actually met the author a few years ago. I mean, if you met him, you would not think that he's an author of such an important book, in the ecosystem, right? He's so down to earth. So obviously, I asked him the question, why did he write the book? So it wasn't so much as an intention to write a book. Like today, you have an intention to say, oh, my startup experience, whatever. For him, it wasn't so much an intention to release a book, but rather a documentation or a journal, if you may, of his involvement in the in the ecosystem, right? And obviously, with lots of influences and all that stuff, and then it just became the book in the end.
Wow. Like it came from like a personal entries from like a personal blog into a book.
Yeah. So yeah, something like that. So obviously the book has been read by millions, used by many people. That's why I think the event that I attended was, well, obviously related to startups and all that. So he's definitely an influential personality in the ecosystem.
Would you say that because of their survival that they go through every day and the touch training is actually a very good breeding ground for like startup life later?
Uh, okay, I wouldn't say that's a formula. I think it's just the way of the Israelis.
Hmm.
Or maybe people in the Middle East. If you met people from the Middle East, they tend to have that kind of similar characteristics. I remember joining the first time when I joined the Google Launchpad in San Francisco. So I was paired with a couple other Israeli mentors, right?
Yeah.
And so I think in Vietnam or in Southeast Asia, we tend to be kind of very polite, right?
That's
We
true.
try not. I mean, we are honest, but then we are also polite. So we kind of smooth things over, right? But not the Israelis. They're like back straight to the point, and even amongst themselves, right? They'll tell each other, "No, you're wrong because of this, right?" And what I realized, and I'm somewhat like that. I'm very direct,
Mm-mm.
right? I think a lot of sometimes, I shock some founders maybe, right, by being very direct, right?
Mm.
And that's why I actually I really appreciated those times when I hung out with them, to be mentors,
Mm.
because we could discuss anything, right? It doesn't matter whether they agree with you or not, as long as you can back up, your supposition. If you can back up, what you say, right? And there's a certain level of respect they give to each other for being very honest. When they talk, if you're unfamiliar with the culture, if you listen to them talking, you think that they are sort of like quarreling, having an argument, or it's just a normal way of conversation. So after like maybe a couple hours, I kind of realized that, okay, great, this is something that uh, that I'm comfortable with. I'm comfortable with the discomfort. Put it that way. I think maybe the second year or whatever we came together again, some of it. And I think every Friday they have a session together, like a
Mm-mm.
family time and all that stuff. And typically only the Jewish would, now I forget what's the name, but only the Jewish would attend. And I was really touched that I got invited, to be on the same table as them. Obviously, I did not know. So I went. I said, hey, come join us for dinner. So I went. So I wasn't aware of the significance of the gathering. So when I went and they explained to me, and then I felt really touched that I got included in the group. So yeah.
You came to Vietnam in a very special time, 15 years ago. It was in the aftermath of the financial crisis, 2008. The whole world was shocked. It seemed like not a very good time to be optimistic and then go to an emerging market, right? So what what pushed you to the move?
No, actually, I was in Vietnam way before the financial crisis in 2008. In fact, I just moved to Hanoi. I moved to Hanoi during the financial crisis, 2008, right? I was in Vietnam, for some years before that. So before I came to Vietnam, I was actually living in the US. And then I traveled out to Asia for a couple of years, met some friends. Some friends said, hey, come over to Vietnam, visit before you go back to the US. So I did. And that moment when I landed in Vietnam and was in Ho Chi Minh City, and basically I told myself, yeah, forget the US. So I gave up, yeah, and actually moved to Vietnam. right? About a few years and then started my own business and then sold my business right before the financial crisis. And a couple of years later, I got into startups, right? I think despite whatever global crisis there might be, somehow I think amongst the Vietnamese people, and this is what I really sort of appreciate even until today, and what I always tell people is somehow there's this optimism about you Vietnamese. I mean, I suppose if generations of Vietnamese have gone through severe hardship, right? And I think, this is a kind of monumental that we are doing this chat today, given that tomorrow is the 50th anniversary. I've read, quite a bit of the past history of Vietnam. And if there's ever one word to describe, the Vietnamese, it's resilient. And yeah, somehow there's this optimism, right? It's like, all right, fine. If I cannot have meat, I'll have vegetables. If I can't have vegetables, I'll have, sweet potato, the kind of thing, right? I get a feeling that as long as you are able to survive.
Exactly. I keep seeing that mentality in a lot of ultra successful. So you invested in Topica, which at the time were probably the first significant Vietnamese edtech company. They raised in total $50 million in funding, a record amount for a Vietnamese company at the time. So what made you believe and have conviction in the team?
I I have equity in Topica, but I didn't invest or start Topica, right? It was started by the CEO, Tuấn Pham. I joined Topica by way of an acquisition of my previous business, which was a co-working space and incubator, back in 2015, which led to me thereafter transitioning to running the accelerator as well as, on the fundraising team, right? So actually, I think in total, we raised a little more, I think around 60 million in total, including the early rounds. So up until then, I wasn't quite familiar with the edtech scene, given that it was new anyways, across Southeast Asia. Right? Of course, education companies have been around for a long time, but they're all brick and mortar. Lots of tuition classes, prep classes, and all that. And Tuan, having returned from overseas and having taught at universities, realized that through online, then more Vietnamese that were not in the major cities, would benefit. So he started Topica Uni, which was basically online university degree in collaboration with 6 or 7 different universities. So that went on for about 5 years, which became really successful. And by the time I joined Topica as a senior director, Topica just started Native, which is English small group learning, English learning platform. And again, it's geared towards adult learning. And so if you remember right after the financial crisis, after 2010, many foreign companies started coming to Vietnam, right? So it kind of filled that need for Vietnamese who wanted to learn English or to practice English or more related to the work environment, not so much as a testing to enter colleges. The growth was, amazing. And during my time there, that was when they first tested out Topica EduMore, right? Which is, well, yeah, the short explanation would be the Udemy of Vietnam. And that again, catered to the mobile generation where you're able to learn skill sets, more like not so much as education, but more like skill set acquisition, right? Through short videos, yeah, and instructions, right? And geared towards, the Vietnamese audience, right? And that scaled even faster than native, right? In fact, it was the fastest growing one. And so it was that time that, I realized that, well, okay, not during that time. Okay, I know, for a fact that, Vietnamese love to learn. And even in the past, even before I joined startups, I had colleagues or friends that would still continue studying in the night, go to night classes and all that, even when they're like late 20s or early 30s, right? It's just like, wow, you never stop learning. I say, yeah. And of course, Vietnamese families spend a lot of money on education as well. And hence, you know, I think right after 2015, 2016, we saw a slew of platforms that are geared towards the kids from as young as 5, 6 years old, right? Kindergarten prep, elementary school prep, the kind of thing. And yeah, so education is something that became something that I had a great privilege to be exposed to. And then, of course, during that time, we traveled to China to meet with fellow edtech startups. And my gosh, they are just like streets ahead of everyone, right? Until, of course, the government decided to clamp down, and then it just went down to nothing. During the heydays, I think it was around 2013 to 2019, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, the attention to education was just unbelievable.
You are an ethnic Chinese, and a lot of Singaporeans chose to buy Chinese company. What made you choose Vietnam over China?
I'm ethnic Chinese, meaning to say, all right, my grandparents, my roots came from China.
Yeah.
But my parents were born in Singapore. I was born in Singapore. I grew up in Singapore, at least during the formative years. And then since my 20s, I've been traveling around the world. I think ethnically Chinese is different from being Chinese.
That's true. That's very true. That's true.
But culturally, I think, I still have, very strong Singapore roots
Yes,
with
yes,
my
yes.
Singlish, of course,
Definitely.
how things are being done in Singapore is quite different. But of course, in our Singapore school system, we learn, at least for us Chinese, we learn Mandarin. So I suppose that's something that's easier for Singaporeans when they go to China. But then do not mistake that our Chinese is anywhere near what the Chinese themselves are speaking. We actually speak quite differently. And which is kind of funny because if you look at China and then Taiwan and then Singapore, all three countries, the Chinese there speak very differently. The accent, the word usage and all that stuff. I mean, pretty much like, Vietnam, right? The South, the North and the Central, they're completely different as well.
Definitely,
No,
yeah.
not completely different, but a big significant portion of the spoken language is different.
Yeah. This is hilarious. You say this. We just encounter somebody from Da Nang today, from Quang Nam today, and we absolutely had no idea what he said. I could imagine a similar situation.
Yeah. So again, it's the same thing, in China itself, right? If you go further up north, for me, I would probably not understand at least 50% of what they're saying. It's much easier for me to speak or to listen, to understand the Southern Chinese, because I think that's where our roots came from, Southern China, the Guangdong, the Canton area.
Yeah. That's definitely the case. So, what else? What other reason? Is there any other reason to choose Vietnam over China?
Okay, I think it's not so much as I chose Vietnam. Like I said, I wasn't even in Vietnam. Vietnam wasn't even on my radar of any country to go to. Right. I remember when I was living in New York, I had some Vietnamese friends and they're like, oh yeah, I should, you guys should go to Vietnam. And I'm like, no, it's just a hike, whatever, right? There were a lot of sanctions going on with Vietnam, and Vietnam hasn't even joined ASEAN at the time, I think, right?
Yeah.
But then so happened that, during my travel outside of the US, I met some friends and they're not even Vietnamese. I met some people. One of them is actually a Malaysian guy and he got posted to Vietnam to work. So he invited me to Vietnam. And so I came here solely because of him. And actually, so people ask me what got me to come, what inspired me to come to Vietnam. I said, no, it's just a golf. I just came here for golf and I never left. Yeah.
He came here for golf and never golf, never
And
left.
yeah, I never left, So then, of course, after that, I got into the golf business, really, started manufacturing in Vietnam. I had a couple of retail shops and then I sold that business in 2007 and 2008, decided to move to Hanoi permanently.
That's actually very interesting. You actually came here for golf, but you
Yeah.
never left. This is hilarious because I don't think we have the best golf course in the world.
No. Actually, Vietnam has. Of course, not at that time when I came, but then, Vietnam already had some of the better golf courses that I've ever played in. Not to say that I've played many, because I just started at that time, right? But it was certainly, very good, very well conditioned. They were newly built. I remember one of my first games was at Tudor, which today is still around, right? And I remember playing in the East Course, the West Course, and met a lot of wonderful people. Then, of course, you have Song Bay. And then, back then when I came, Vietnam had maybe, if you include Dalat, you probably have 4 golf courses in the whole country.
4.
Today, Vietnam has about 60 golf courses.
Yeah, 50
So,
times
so
different.
the growth has been quite phenomenal,
Yeah.
right? And I think the first PGA event that was held in Hanoi was at Shilin, and my company, my apparel was actually one of the sponsors. So so I've been pretty blessed and privileged, right, to be involved in certain milestone events.
It's actually quite a story, quite a history. You told me that you made about 11 investment in your career. So which one is your favorite?
There are a few. So I made about 5 at Touchstone. A couple of those that I like a lot. I think in the end, as a VC, right, even though I spent 4 years as a VC with Touchstone, I have to admit VC is really not my game. If I were to tell people, or why those who are my favorite, it doesn't make sense, because it wasn't so much. Okay, like I think my ex-partner said that I'm still very founder leaning. I share in the excitement of the vision of founders, not so much the bottom line. Like, oh yeah, 10x return or 20x return, which of course is important, I think, as well, for founders to understand that.
Yeah,
But I think I was a lot more excited about the vision. For example, one of my favorites is this startup called Forte Biotech. And it came from one Singaporean and one Vietnamese founders, both met in school, a long time ago in Singapore. And they started this because the Singaporean founder had his family had previous experiences in shrimp farming. And he saw how terrible diseases could do to a farming business. So now he had the opportunity, to get hold of medical biotechnology to basically help farmers detect, early signs of diseases. Some of the diseases, basically will wipe out an entire, shrimp farm, right?
yeah.
And and of course, shrimp farming is one of the big industries in Vietnam. So when he mentioned that, and then he brought in his really, clunky, small, I guess, prototype test machine, right? I was completely sold. I think we made that investment maybe 3 years ago, 2022, I think. And today they've expanded into Thailand, Indonesia. Basically, shrimp farmers, especially those in Vietnam that they've worked with, have discovered a lot of different things that otherwise they would not have. For example, how they've raised healthier crops through less use of antibiotics, for example, and a faster turnaround of the crops in the market. Things like this. You know, it's not something that you're going to see great traction in 3 or 4 years, but it's something that 10 years from now you're going to look at it and go like, wow, this guy actually has created an impact, or this startup has created an impact in the industry. The other one was FMCG, pretty much matching your top ones, mom and pop shop, with
Yeah.
distributors and wholesalers, right?
Mm-mm.
Founders were really interesting. Both of them came from Colombia, and they saw a lot of similarities between Latin America and Vietnam, right? They showed me photos, and if you take out the word on the signboard, you would think that they're all the same shops.
That.
And then, of course, Latin America, basically, or at least that's what they say, it's about 5-6 years ahead in terms of, the mom and pop shop businesses. So they brought the idea here, so I think one of the visions that they had in mind was basically creating an e-commerce with a mom and pop shop. And that to me was a really hard problem to solve. But if they're able to solve that, if they're able to crack that, then you're going to see basically seismic change in the way how people buy things, especially in an environment like Vietnam. right? Yeah, so it was like, yeah, it's like all or nothing type of. Yeah, so yeah, so in that sense, I think I'm still very founder leaning. Personally, a couple of good startups I've made investment in. One of them is a platform for, I call it Uber for headhunting. I call it Uber for headhunting because headhunters work in very specialized field. So he created, or at that time, now he's able to, but before he was trying to create a network of headhunters, which were never done before. Everything is pretty much on a get to know you basis, right? But so that was something that kind of interests me a lot. Because 3 years before, I met someone in Thailand, and he was a headhunter himself, and we kind of wanted to digitize this whole headhunting vertical, but somehow couldn't really find a solution. So 3 years later, in 2019, spoke to this founder, and I thought, yeah, maybe this guy has cracked it. And third, by the third conversations we had, I basically proposed, a small investment, and he said yes. So
That's very good. You mentioned that you very much interested in the idea in a marketplace, but it is known fact that it's very hard to scale a marketplace. What did you see in the founders for you to overcome that fear?
okay, so I mean, it's not like he just woke up and came up with this idea, right? First, I mean, he's still very young, right? So I think his first job was with a startup. Shortly after, he, started his own startup. So the startup that he had, the first one before any was in employee rewards, right? So he ran that for maybe a year and realized that companies do not have problems in terms of rewarding the employees. In fact, it's actually counterproductive when you have a good rewards program, right? And so as he started talking to his clients who are employers, he realized that, the bigger problem is in looking for talents, right? And talents is not just about your skills, your job skills, but it's really about being able to understand and having the commitment and the passion to the job that you do, right? And that speaks very much of the startup environment, right? I think for the large part, especially newer startups, I think everyone involved bring a lot of passion into the idea. There's a lot of belief, and it's not about money, it's not about rewards. And that's why a lot of all these startup talents, they're willing to work longer hours, especially in the beginning. And then once you become a proper business, proper company, then yes, there's some semblance of rules and regulations and whatever, right? So yeah, so he discovered that the problem is not about rewards for employees, but it's really about finding talent so that yeah, companies are able to scale faster. So he kind of pivoted into what he's doing currently. So it's really not about this founder coming and say that, oh yeah, I've done this and I've done that, and then now I want to do this. It's really through a lot of the process of research. I'm sure he did a lot of research in the beginning before he launched the first startup, and then he decided to launch the startup. And then through it all, it further research and further interviews this understanding of what he's trying to bring, the value that he's trying to bring to companies. That gave him further data and research materials to understand that, hey, you know what, maybe this is not the best solution. And for him to be able to sort of let go of a certain idea and then going on to something that solve a bigger problem, you don't find that in a lot of young founders.
That quality of recognizing the problems,
Yeah,
pivoting,
and actually having the humility to admit that, hey, you know what, this might not be the best idea.
that's actually very interesting because in a lot of time, it's a balance between humility and confidence. Because if you don't have any backbone, you can walk this path. It's very interesting that you say that, but humility is important.
No, I think it takes a lot of confidence to be humble. I think you know
Sure.
what you're trying to describe is actually more of hubris and arrogance. And you see a lot of founders sticking to that one idea, right? And basically every nail is a solution to a hammer. Whereas this guy is able to say that, hey, you know what, the hammer is actually the wrong idea. Maybe I should be using something else, right? Plaster, or blue tack, something like this. right?
Ability to fall in love with the problems remind me of an Israeli billionaire. He has this book about fall in love with the problem, not fall in love with the solutions. I think his name is Levi. I think that's a very interesting point you take. So when you approach a young founder who you have like a limited experience with, how did you talk them into going with you? Especially in this investment market, when you have a lot of investors chasing the deal, so what would be your pitch to the founders?
Okay, beyond having a reasonable understanding and knowledge of the domain, right? Which I've been lucky enough over the years, through my a lot of other experiences, I was able to gather. I think beyond that, it's really about the fight between, at least for myself, with the founders, right? How do I feel about the founder? Do I think that the founder is being condescending, saying yes to everything simply because he needs the money, or is he able to sort of stand his own ground, have a proper debate on the whole issue, right? And you got to, I think maybe through experience, and I'm sure a lot of my other VC colleagues have a better ability to discern, whether the founders, are adept at executing the idea. But it's I guess for angel investing, it really comes down to the inner gut feel.
Inner gut. That's actually a very interesting idea. That's a very interesting idea because it seems like in the world there's two camps between inner gut and being methodical about something.
Well, look, I think if you're dealing with your own money and you're willing to accept the consequence, right, then it has to be, to me, I feel that it's more inner gut. But if it's like, for example, as a VC before, where you are dealing with other people's money, then you have to be methodical, right? Your investors are not going to understand, your the gut feel that you have, right? And if it's right, you're the champion. If you're wrong, then there's a lot of accountability, and the accountability cannot come from a perceived gut feel. It has to be documented, and the documentation of facts arriving to that decision of investment has to be methodical.
That's actually this remind me of a lot of things. That's really interesting. It remind me a lot of debating process at Bridgewater about the investing philosophy. It's very methodical. So that's a team versus personal difference in approach. You mentioned that saying yes to everything an investor say is a red flag. So it's come to a very favorite question among our audience, which is which are your personal red flags in founders?
Well, I think for me, the most fundamental red flag would be, you know, is the founder chasing, is really reasonable in wanting to solve a problem or capturing a market opportunity,
What does that mean?
right? All right, for example, 9 out of 10 founders you talk to today, talk about AI. Fundamentally, I don't see any big problem with AI.
Mm.
You know, fundamentally, whatever tools that you have available today, pretty much work the way it's supposed to work. It can be improved, of course, right? A lot of things can be improved, but is that really a big problem? No, it's not. Now, if you need to reduce the steps that you need to do from 10 to 5, is that a big problem? No, not really. Maybe for bigger companies, yes. But generally, is that a big problem to solve? Is that something, no, I guess not. So to me, I feel that, it's really capturing, and all these founders are, super, techy, very talented, smart, and obviously they follow trends, right? And AI, everything is all about AI, right? But then if you are reasonable enough, then you kind of understand that, okay, a lot of these are simply AI enabled. It's not really AI play, right? What's your understanding? All right, if you really need to build AI, what is that going to achieve? I mean, by deploying AI, you're going to have, I don't know, maybe, easier to reach out to, to get leads, right? It's not a big problem.
So you would say that a focus on trends and tunes is
is a red flag for you rather than like the focus on the problem?
Yeah, I think it's really focusing on the problem, number one, a significant problem. And number two, people that that you're solving the problem for are willing to pay you.
Yeah, and paying a customer is actually very important, more important than the tax that you employ. Let's talk about your latest startup, Qrospay. You recently launched Qrospay, a service that empower tourists and visitors to Southeast Asia. So, what makes Qrospay different for you?
Okay, CrossPay wasn't the first idea, right? So about 4 years ago, around 2021, I was looking, I kind of relooked into this whole fintech. And there were things in the market, for example, the Revolut product, right? That I thought, all right, since Vietnam is promoting tourism, a product like Revolut would work from Vietnam. And I started looking into that. And there were a lot of good reasons to doing that. Okay. And yeah, of course, it's lucrative. I mean, if you just look at, Revolut even 4 years ago, they were doing very well. Out of Singapore, you have U-Trip. From Malaysia, you have this other thing called Big Pay, right? So there were already available products for me to kind of look at it and go like, yeah, how can I improve on it? How can I bring benefits to Vietnam and all the pros and, whatever. And so back to what I said earlier. So essentially, I'm capturing an opportunity. I'm not exactly solving a problem. Yes, there is a big problem because Vietnamese for a start, because Vietnamese, love to travel and all that stuff, but they have no way of getting their hands onto such a product, right? When they travel. So other than that, I was like, yeah, and sort of, yeah, didn't sort of take the initial hype was there, but it didn't kind of build. And then shortly after Vietnam launched Viet QR, and so, like everyone in Vietnam with a bank account, I was like, wow, fantastic. I don't need to go to ATM, right? And I can just scan and pay. And I was actually quite amazed, at the rate of adoption by merchants compared to before COVID, where e-wallets had to pay money to merchant. Now merchants are basically adopting, a cashless payment system willingly. Even the mom and pop shop, downstairs of my apartment that I, buy things occasionally, went from cash to digital literally overnight. And so, so I started look, and then, of course, Vietnam opened up, the whole region opened up. I was traveling, and in Singapore, obviously Singapore also kickstarted instant payment. I was transferring money to friends and family members through my bank app, with a phone number, right? And then Malaysia, has another product which allows Singaporeans to use. So when I went to Malaysia, I used the app, and again, I carry no cash. And to me, that was a great feeling, a great freedom. And then I started looking at, all the other tourists, Westerners. And upon doing some research, I realized that, hey, this works only when people have an account. Cut a long story short, I spent about 2.5 years basically researching on the market and on the viability, on the opportunity and future potential of instant payment. I realized that, this is that one time where a global payment network is about to be established, right? And this whole network basically starts with Southeast Asia, and then I see Europe, is also starting something similar. Brazil already has one, India has one, China obviously has gone digital, for 10 years. So yeah, and then last year I decided that, hey, you know what? I think this is a big enough problem to solve in terms of, for the travelers.
So you definitely have like Southeast Asia ambitions. So which one is your favorite Southeast Asia market?
My favorite market, well, obviously is Vietnam. Yeah, I think, Vietnam is not even anywhere near 30% of its potential.
Mm, mm, mm.
And I like the fact that, Vietnam is, especially with the recent changes, I think, Vietnam, the whole country has sort of become smaller because other provinces have merged, or many of the provinces have merged, to creating, better, hopefully economic environment, down the line. And also like the fact that each of those province, is sort of tasked to developing its own economy. And that's very important. And you really don't see that in too many other countries in Southeast Asia.
That's a very, very interesting insight. Like you, I know you have experience in Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. So for a lot of fintech startup, they have this fear of try and developed. There's this comment in the startup world, like, why would you try this idea if Revolut gonna come for it, if Google gonna do for it, if Stripe gonna do it? So when you started this idea, do you think of like competing with all the big players?
No, I see all these players as necessary parties in the entire financial marketplace. Everybody plays a different role. Obviously, if you saw what Revolut did 10 years ago when they first launched in 2015, today the ambition is basically to become bank. The card is the entry level, entry position. The founders did the same thing, went on pitching, circuit, joint competition, and so on and so forth, right? And recently I read, in fact, only I think yesterday I read an article about how Gmail came about. Basically, when Gmail first launched in 2004, it's crazy to think that it's only 20 years ago. You had Yahoo and Hotmail basically covering like almost 95% of the Gmail market, right?
That's true.
And of the email market, not Gmail market, email market.
Mm-hmm.
And then Gmail was basically started by this engineer at Google. It was not even supposed to be a product. But then because of the culture of Google, they say, all right, fine, go try it out. And all he did was, to basically develop an email console that people, 100 people would use, and word spread. And obviously they have enough marketing dollar to promote it. And today it's serving, more than 2 billion people, right? Yes, it may not be the same example because Google wasn't even that big back in 2004. They were big, but not that big. Certainly not as big as Yahoo or Microsoft, who owns Hotmail, right? And yeah, you look at, different players. Everybody starts small. Most people start small. So do I see it as a competitor? No. I think it's more of saying that, look, the market that I serve, the market I serve for Qrospay, my users actually use Revolut in conjunction with my product. So that's not so much as a competitor, but more as a complementing partner. People ask me, what is your app? Are you going to kill credit cards? I say, no, I need credit card. I'm not going to kill the bank. I need the banks. I mean, if anything else, I think, you're going to see a slow transition. You look at banks. How do foreigners access money? They get money from, money changer or ATM, mainly ATM. And they get ATM because they have a credit card. Now, when they use ATM, but then you look at banks, ATM services are actually a cost center for banks. It's a necessary product that they have to offer to their customers. Obviously, 20 years ago, it was the best thing that happened, right? You can get money anywhere, right? But today, that's no longer true.
Right. Okay. So think about competition as a complementary partner. That's how you operate, and I think that's very wise. It put you in a creative and operative mode instead of a fear mode, and I think that's just a way to go. That's the way everybody who build something should imagine. And knowing humankind, that we had tendency to hoard, to try more things, buy more things. We know that there's gonna be a place for our idea out there. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you just got to make sure that you have at least in my mind, I feel that I have a large enough user base to at least create a strong foundation before I'm able to move on and scale the product further, right? And I think it's really solving one pain that credit card companies cannot solve, banks cannot solve. Take for example, if you go to Thailand, how are you able to use your bank app to pay? Not now. Maybe in the future you can because you have Vietnamese bank account here and it's in Southeast Asia. And even if you have credit cards, you still can't pay when you go to Thailand because many of the places do not accept credit cards.
That's very, very true. Merchant fees for a credit card processor could be
Yeah.
COVID issues. So, do you have any advice for your fellow Singaporean and other expats when they do business in Vietnam?
All right. It's the same thing, right? Especially
The
to all my Singapore brethren, right? Coming to Vietnam, right? And if they have not been to Vietnam before and they want to come to Vietnam to capture the opportunities, I think the first thing that my Singapore brothers and sisters need to do is to forget about Singapore, what they know about Singapore. Yeah,
That's it. That's it. Just forget what you know about Singapore. What you
yeah. Just come here and really learn. How. It, yeah.
So Vietnam is actually, even though it's trying a lot to improve its investment environment, it's actually known for its red tapes and bureaucracies. So how would you navigate that? How did you navigate that? That's it.
Okay. The good thing about I wouldn't call it red tape or bureaucracy, right? I think if you come here to do business, I think Vietnam has stabilized its regulation for doing business, right? It's fairly clear what you need to do. Of course, if you want to cut corners, then and that's when all these troubles start coming in. I think in my experience in the few countries in Southeast Asia, I think outside of Singapore, I think Vietnam is probably the easiest place to do business.
Wow,
Or,
that's a
or sorry, not to do business. Sorry, to set up a business. Doing business is another matter, but to even set up, yourself properly to do business, I think Vietnam is the easiest after Singapore.
a huge compliment for me from you. That's
Well,
we
I
will.
mean, I've seen a lot of changes, obviously, and I think every time, things change for the better, right? And I think, the especially with the new government or the new leadership, not government, but new leadership, I think they're very responsive to the needs of what Vietnam got to have, you know, to building itself to the 2050, vision.
I think it's a new leadership is very visionary
Yeah.
and very action driven, and we look
Hmm.
forward to the future that bring for us. So you told me that you 60 years old young, 60 year old young, yeah, and at this age, a lot of people look forward to a retirement. But you sit here kicking and then setting up new ideas. How not to be rejected as a 60 years old founder.
Okay. I think in a sense, over the last 14 years or so, since I got into startup, I have the great fortune to work with young people, very young, innovative, intelligent, talented, people from all over, right? And it made me realize that, number one, ideas don't die. Problems do not disappear. Things need to be done. And I think my collective experience basically can be put to a lot of good use. Number one, maybe as I've been doing anyway, the last, few years, a lot of mentoring of founders and all that stuff, right? And so I think the difference is this. If I have a job, 8 to 5 for like 30 years, and that's all I know what to do or how to do, then as these people get older and then it's time for them to retire, right, they find it hard to transition because it's almost like a shock, right? How do you go clock in, clock out, doing the same thing or facing this kind of same problem, solving the same problem, you know and then all of a sudden you stop and then you have to jump into another pool whereby everyone is a competitive swimmer. So I was lucky that the last 14 years I've been in that competitive pool. So to me, that's normal. So I even view retirement very differently, right? I think it's a waste, right? I think in this time and age, I think people who are approaching 50, especially those in the 40s and approaching 50, they should start thinking of really learning a new skill. I don't care what skill, be it writing, be it learning AI, become a prompt engineer, do whatever you need to do, learn a new skill other than what you're doing. That it's going to be, completely uncomfortable, right? You have to figure out, what the hell is this? What is this prompt? How, right? Learn from younger people. Be humble enough to approach young people and say, how do you do this? And because of their collective experience, by simply asking, they will be able to open up their minds to a lot more, except that they don't. So by the time they get to retire, there's always this fear of learning something new. But if you start learning something new before you retire, when you have no pressure of learning, call it as a hobby, call it as a second knowledge, whatever, right? I had the opportunity, so I was lucky, I was blessed, right? But I think it's very different today. So yeah, to me, and the other reason is, anything that's new. I mean, take for example, okay, let's not talk about, the philosophy of AI, whatever, right? The actual deployment of AI, in a more publicized way, has happened only like maybe 3-4 years ago, right? Okay. And then all of a sudden you see this trend happening, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're 15 years old, 3 years ago, let's say 4 years ago. It doesn't matter you're 15 years old or 50 years old. That's a new thing. Everybody starts off at the same line. So why wouldn't anyone want to learn if you have the opportunity to learn? Why do people always say, oh yeah, this is for the young people? No, new things get invented, new things get discovered. Everyone has every right to basically capitalize on it if you can.
True. That's very true. Like you say, the problem would never end, and the idea would never stop emerging. We always have like a new canvas to paint on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, looking back at your 40 years old, 40 years career, what would you have done less of?
Nothing. I think everything that I've done, I've given my fullest attention. Even the mistakes I made, I think I've done to the fullest of the mistakes. And you can't look back and say that, hey, I should have done this better. Anyone that look back, will always be able to say, I can do this better. But you can't, right? You can only not repeat the same mistake forward.
This is actually very interesting because I see a consistent pattern in a lot of successful people in interview. They say they actually talk about the same thing. That there are very few things that they regret. So, what books would you recommend to people?
What books? Okay, one book that I would always kind of refer to is this book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Outlier. Yeah, that's where I first come across this, theory of the, 10,000 hours, right? And yeah, of course, it's not like, you can't take it literally and say, that, oh, in 10,000 hours, you become an expert. No, it's not. The fact that what it actually says is that you need to put in the time, the effort, to learning something, right? Everybody starts off, like being, super bad at what they're doing, right? Whether it's sports or anything else or coding, right? But if you are willing to put in the effort, right? Of course, your innate talent come into play, but your innate talent cannot bring you that, can only bring you that far. You still have to put in the effort. You still have to put in the learning. And so to me, it's So I think he has a second book on that, The Outlier, that just got released a few months ago. I want to get that. And then the second book is not non-fiction. It's actually a fiction book about life in Long Island in the US, in New York State, Long Island. It's about this family moving to this neighborhood, and all the neighbors were mafias, and how the life. And it was just so funny. It was just I've never read a book that made me laugh out loud every time whenever I read it.
What is the name of it?
It's called The Gold Coast.
Yeah. The only two.
I would say these two stand out for me. Of course, the other one I like very much is something more personal. Is the book written by our late leader Lee Kuan Yew. He had 3 volumes. I love the first volume. From third world to first.
Actually, I'm reading it just today. Actually, it was
Okay, yeah.
it was very good.
And then of course Singapore just had we just have our election last week, so
Yeah.
but that book basically kind of gave us an insight into his vision of Singapore, and to me I think that's very very inspiring.
Very interesting that you say visions. It seemed like the war split into the visionary and the pessimist. And we take visionaries for granted. But do you know like how like a pessimist could convert into a visionary?
Wow. Okay, put it this way. If I have to bet on a visionary or a pessimist, I will make more money from pessimists. Okay, I will lose more money on visionary, right? Because the chances of success is so minuscule, right? It might not even happen, during a fixed period of time. I mean, a pessimist is always right because they are basing on everything that already happened. And by not changing, by not trying to change too much, it will always be the same thing. Good and bad, yeah. But, I met a guy, he's going back to Singapore again. He's Dutch and he used to live in Singapore in the 60s, right? So upon knowing that, I'm a Singaporean, he said, you know what? I used to live in Singapore in the 60s and when Lee Kuan Yew became the prime minister. And his impression of Singapore was, of total pessimism. And when I spoke to him, it was actually in the early 2000s, so about 20 years ago. So imagine 20 years ago, Singapore. And he said to me that, if anybody told me at that time that Singapore will be what it is today, right, I would bet my last cent to say it will not be.
Wow, good
You
good
know,
for him. He didn't make that bet. That would be
yeah,
tragic.
and yeah, so if you look at it and go like, all right, if you're in Singapore in the 60s, you could never imagine, given any kind of time frame, right? 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, that, to have Singapore to be where it is today. I've met people in Vietnam, right? And they look at Vietnam 20 years ago and say that no, Vietnam, nobody will stay, no Vietnamese will live in a high-rise building because there's, so much land. But then, of course, with creative restructuring, urbanization, and all that stuff, now you see a lot of young urbanites or young Vietnamese, now becoming urbanites. And they move into like a Vinhome.
It's very, 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 very good wrap-ups. I think it's very important that we look beyond what we see now and then see more like our imaginations for 30 years, 40 years to be a visionary. Yeah. That's actually a good ending. So where can our audience find you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. If you go into LinkedIn, you probably won't see my photo, but then you see a big circle. So that would be me, Bobby Liu, or Facebook. Yeah, this would be the two main channels. Yeah.
Okay. And you can also visit him and check out his startups at qrospay.com, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, that's it.
qrospay.com. Thank you so much, Bobby, for being here today again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we love to have you come back and maybe 3 years from now, 4 years from now, when we see the traction of Qrospay.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this useful, you can subscribe to our show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast of choice. Please give us a rating or a review because it will help us produce more useful content. You can find more episodes and learn more about the show at sandrasletter.com. See you in the next episode.